Welcome to Uncommonly More with Stacey Harris. I am Stacey. I'm the host of this show and the CEO of podcast production agency Uncommonly More. My team and I work with podcasters just like you to shift shows from frustrating time sucks to productive members of sales teams with professional, strategic podcast production. You know what? I think that's enough. Let's get into the show and we'll talk more there. So last week we sat down and we talked about the time I almost quit this show. And today I think we should take it a step further because in that story, I had all of the data to see that the purpose of my show was being fulfilled. I was helping people. I was getting clients. All of the boxes were getting checked on the results side, right? But the process was the problem. But sometimes it's just not right. It's just not the right time. And that's the story I want to tell today. Now, in full disclosure, this story technically has another part because this podcast was actually co-hosted with someone you have heard on the show before, someone whose show I was on recently, because she launched a podcast this year. Brandy Lawson of Fiery Effects. She was my co-host on that show called Your Biz BFFs. It was a great show. We had a really good time doing it. I'm going to talk a little bit about it today. But spoiler alert, we only did that show for about a year. So I want you to kind of notice some of the differences, some of the contrast in how we came to the decision to quit versus the choice I made in last week's story where I was like, actually, there's just a problem here we need to solve. Here's how we solve it. Things are better now, right? Because that it's different. It's different in this story. So, flashback with me. Let's get back in the Wayback Machine. The year is 2015. I know. It was a different time. And I was living in Arizona still. I was still living in Phoenix, which is where I actually met Brandy. We both lived in Phoenix. We had, at that point, been friends for a couple of years. And I was really craving putting together a small, intimate group for women who owned businesses and wanted to come together and network, but also actually be really honest about what was happening in their lives and their businesses as whole-ass individuals, which there wasn't a lot of. And that part kind of remains to be true. So I started hosting these weekly coffee chats, coffee dates, coffee meetups at this really cool coffee place that I loved in Central Phoenix. And Brandy started sort of co-hosting them with me. And after about a year, we decided we should start a second business together around this. Mostly, honestly, just to cover the cost of doing this thing. Also, so that we could provide some additional support. This was never meant to replace or subsidize our core businesses. We both owned businesses individual. I was running the Stacey Harris. She's got Fiery Effects. Like, this wasn't a replacement for, this was just something we were going to do together. So when we decided to formalize it, we realized we're going to need some content. And so I, of course, immediately said we should have a podcast. And so we started looking at what we wanted to do on the podcast. And ultimately what we did is we sort of turned the podcast into a bit of a book club. I think we did like 1 or 2 episodes a month. And mostly we talked about books or things that had come up in conversations inside of our membership that we were running, which is how we expanded our in-person meetups, was with an online community. And we were managing it. We were making it work. I was doing all of the editing. We were obviously recording together. We were planning together. I was doing all the editing. Brandy handled all of the website stuff. The division of labor was pretty solid. But we got to a point in probably early fall or late summer of 2016. I think we technically finished that show in like October or November of 2016. And we sort of one day looked at each other and we were like, do we want to keep doing this? Our first batch of people who had joined us for this membership were getting ready to renew. We were sort of deciding what we wanted to do with the business, but we had to first decide what we were going to do with the show. Did it make sense for us to keep this going? We had a really good time doing it. This is one of the places that where there was a real contrast to what I went through when I got back from Mexico and I was dealing with, my show alone, is we both really enjoyed it. It didn't feel like too much work or too much effort, but we had to go through a very similar process. We had to look at the data, the numbers, the math of it all. We had to sit down and we had to say, cool, what are we getting out of this? Honestly, it wasn't converting into a ton of new members, mostly people who already knew us, listened to the show. And as new people found us, they really just enjoyed the show, which is fine, but wasn't our goal. And so the show wasn't really serving its purpose. And more, the show was becoming an expense, both financially, but also time-wise. When I looked at how much time it took for the two of us to get the show out, even splitting it up, we each had our things. We both had to sit down and record. We both were planning things. We were both marketing the shows, all of those things, right? When we look at these and we go, so what's the payoff here? What could we be doing with this time? And so ultimately we had to sit down and look at, is this thing actually making us any money, or is it just costing us money? And we could not find a way to work the math where that show was making us enough money that it made sense for us to keep it going. Mostly because of where our individual businesses were at the time. There are certainly times in my life and business where I would have kept a show like that show going. Every once in a while, I joke about forcing Brandy to start another show with me, or doing another show on my own, or finding somebody else who wants to co-host a show, maybe completely outside of the world of business, and we just talk about stuff. I am the running gag on this show constantly is me talking about starting a Schitt's Creek podcast, right? So it wasn't just like, oh, I have too many things happening. No, it came down to this show is not serving the purpose that this show was meant to serve. And if you're sitting down and you're looking at your show and there is just no version of the math where the show is fulfilling its purpose, it's time to let it go. And ultimately, that's what it came down to for us. We couldn't refine the process any further than we had. The process was great. Now, in full disclosure, with hindsight and several more years' experience, there are things about our process I would have changed. But ultimately, that wasn't the problem. The problem was a purpose problem. The problem was not a production problem. The problem was not a process problem. The show could not fulfill its purpose. Not in the restraints we had given it. Maybe if it had been both of our full-time gigs and it had our undivided attention, certainly things would have been different. But at some point, doing the podcast was costing us time, money, and energy that needed to be redirected into our individual businesses. And I've worked with clients where this was true as well. The way their podcast stood, it was costing them time that they could have spent on marketing that was actually getting them traction, right? I did some consulting work with a client years ago now, probably not long after this, probably like 2018. And she and I were talking and she was doing these videos and they were killing it. All of her traffic, all of her sales were coming from these videos, but she also had a podcast. And some people referenced it, and occasionally it would come up in a conversation with the client, but generally people found the podcast because they found the videos. And so at some point we had introduced another nurture step, a whole new nurture loop, when what clients were actually trying to do is come pay her, come hire her, come buy her programs. And so we were like, maybe it's time for this to go, because this time, this energy, and this attention, both yours and your potential clients, could be going and should be going elsewhere. And that's the discussion, Brandy and I were in, is we're now spending time on this show that could deliver us a better ROI somewhere else, in our own individual shows, in our own individual businesses, in something unrelated altogether. So ultimately, we decided that this was not a thing. This was not an entity worth fixing. It didn't mean we were wrong to do it. It didn't mean that, we had some major falling out and everything. She had been on this show subsequently. I've been on her show subsequently. We're still very good friends. We may do something like that again in the future. Who knows? But in that time and in that season, it wasn't right. And this is where I want to point you and anyone who maybe is listening to this conversation and says, damn, I got to quit the show. It's just not worth it. Cool. Save an episode of this show that we've done talking about relaunching versus launching a new show and give yourself some space and time. Take the time to do whatever will work, whatever will deliver you your result, whatever will serve you. Do that. And then maybe go to that episode if you ever catch the bug again, right? Because not everybody should be podcasting. On the flip side, if you're listening to this conversation and you listen to last week's conversation and you're going, it's not a purpose problem. It's a process problem. It's a production problem. Those are solvable problems. Let's solve them. Let's sit down and get you a better process, a better structure, a better system and foundation. Let's fix that. We can do that. Maybe it's a production problem. Cool. Hire me. Hire our agency. That's how to solve production problems. That's the easiest problem. I can solve that in an hour. We've got that. Get the support you need. But again, if it's a purpose problem, if the show is not fulfilling the purpose for you, the purpose for your audience, both, which is entirely possible, it's time to let it go. And again, this doesn't mean it's forever. It just means that as it is right now, no, it's not working. It's time to figure out something else. All right? That's it. A quickie one today. If you have questions, you have thoughts, I'd love to hear from you. Reach out, let me know. And again, process and production problems. Head over to uncommonlymore.com/podcast production. We can solve that problem by the time this week is over. Reach out. We'll get you on my calendar. We can talk about what your next steps are, and we'll solve that problem. All right? I will see you on our call. And for sure next week on the show. Talk to you soon. If you made it to this point of the show and you still happen to be listening, which statistically is unlikely, I want to say thank you for listening. Thanks for hanging out with me today, and I want to hear from you. So reach out on social or via email and let me know what actions you're going to take from today's episode. Because honestly, that's why we produce the show. That's why I record this show. That's why my team does all the work to release this show. Is so that we can help you. We can help make a difference in your show and consequently in your business. If you haven't left a review for the show, head over to ratethispod.com/more. It's an easy way to show some love to the show and also help us reach more podcasters who are looking for the same kind of support you were looking for. If you have any suggestions or ideas or thoughts you would like me to address on the show, be sure to reach out. Again, like I say a lot, this is the start of the conversation, and I can't wait to hear what you have to say.